Hello everyone. Okay, today is the 24th of January 2024 and I am going to continue. I thought it would be a good idea to continue with the interview that I started. I did a video yesterday about Monsieur Pierre De Gaulle, the grandson of General de Gaulle, and I thought it would be interesting to actually do the second part, the rest of the interview, although not all of it, but most of it. And he was talking, I will just reread the very last part of where we left off yesterday. The interviewer was asking him about, he had been talking about the conflict with Russia and the Ukraine and about the Russians and so on. And he was talking about the Russians' mentality, their disposition, and how the Russians think. And he said, at the very end, he said, you know that I used to go to Russia often, and I think we made now the serious mistake of looking at this conflict and looking at other countries too through the prism of Western eyes. The Russians are perfectly aware that President Putin saved the country from the ruin after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The country had collapsed. The oligarchs, a few men, robbed and plundered the country, transferred the assets of the country to their bank accounts and the Americans helped them in this. They took the money to the US, Israel, and London, and Putin stopped all that, restored little by little a renewed pride of this great country, and it is a great nation, a strong nation. I'm still going to quote some figures, lest some of your audience think that I am blindingly pro-Russian. But the figures, the data is there. The reality is that Russia will have a growth rate higher than 4% this year, an industrial growth rate above 6%, the balance of payments limited to 1%. And then we hear Bruno Le Maire, who said in 2022 that he was going to bring the Russian economy down to its knees, and also of China, he was going to bring the Chinese economy to its needs. This is a lie, he says. It is a manipulation, and therefore, being a manipulation, it is also an admission of powerlessness. And then I read this yesterday, and then the interviewer, he says, this amounts to systematic disinformation by the government. This is a lie that is told to the French people and to Europeans, and I denounce it now once again. Then the interviewer says, we had already spoken about the Ukrainian situation we have been talking about the Ukrainian situation which is a proxy war for the interests of others, she says, notably perhaps Americans, using the Ukraine to attack Russia and especially to regain control of Europe, as you pointed out. How do you analyze now the Israel-Palestine conflict? His answer is yes, but I'm going to answer your question, but just to add one more thing about the Ukraine before I answer your question. Few people are speaking about what is happening in Germany right now. We have huge demonstrations going on of farmers who are blocking cities because farmers find themselves in a catastrophic economic situation. This on the one hand, it is on the one hand, and it's also receiving an enormous intake of grains from the Ukraine into their country at artificially discounted prices. This movement is also taking place in France, but what is happening is that no politician is defending the farmers. No one protects their interest. Is one more window into seeing the social divide between people and their governments, which is totally hidden, obscured in the speech I referred to, the speech of President Macron that we referred to earlier, speech given about 5 or 6 days ago. Now, regarding your question, Israel and Palestine, actually, if you allow me to mention him, my grandfather, General de Gaulle, in 1967, gave that famous address where he mentioned all the problems caused by the conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Talking about the Israeli position at the time, and he was in favor of 2 states, 2 people, 2 states, under, he said at the time, under the United Nations Charter, with the protection of UN troops. It's bad translation. The UN troops protecting the territory, under the protection, I suppose, of the UN troops, and to give Jerusalem an international status guaranteed by the UN. And I would add now the evacuation by Israel of the territories they have occupied has to take place. So I think that Israel obviously has a legitimate right to respond when attacked and to defend its vital interest, but not in this appalling way, with massive bombings of the civilian population systematically. The Israeli government said openly that it would go to the end, to the very end, whatever it takes. I fear that it will go to the end of forced evacuation of the entire population of Palestine. This is not the solution. It is absolutely necessary to stop this conflict. It is a horrific humanitarian tragedy. Actually, as an aside, I saw, I think 2 days ago, that the whole of the Gaza Strip was now in the dark. The electricity had been switched off, and with no communication, obviously. So, almost 2 million people in a tiny, diminutive area of land. You can imagine being bombed with no electricity, hardly any food, no medicines, of course, little amount of water, and I don't know, being bombed, being starved. This is, I don't know, to me it's horrendous. But anyway, he continues, almost 1 million people have been displaced, thousands and thousands of people have been killed, and I would say that the right to retaliate in no way excuses the considerable injury being inflicted on the civilian population. And therefore, I regret once again, as a Frenchman, I regret once again that France is deprived of its capacity to arbitrate. France, of course, has a very long history of diplomacy, traditionally anyway. I believe that the position of President Macron, the position that President Macron took to speak out immediately against the ceasefire from the very start, with the Americans and with the Anglo-Saxons and Japan. You remember I pointed out that he always says the Anglo-Saxon, and the reason for this perhaps. and Japan depriving France of perhaps acting as a referee. France has a considerable historic role in the region, a diplomatic role in the region. It is the European nation with the most links to the Arab countries, and I regret that also historically, as in the past, there has been no political will to find a solution. This crisis is there since 1948. This conflict must cease. It cannot be resolved without the full and complete recognition of a Palestinian state, with guarantees for Israel under the UN Charter. Yeah, the UN is not what it used to be though, but anyway. The problem is that here, in this conflict, as is the case in the Ukrainian conflict, the UN the UN no longer fulfills its role. The UN was created specially to resolve conflicts such as this, with international guarantees for resolutions to do with wars. But the UN no longer has the capacity to fulfill its mandate. The interviewer says, the International Court of Justice, yes, these international institutions, which have legitimacy and international law behind them, are unfortunately sidelined a little by they have been sidelined a little by the famous right to protect and right to defend. Therefore, the right to defend oneself, the right to self-defense, I think that the countries, he moves, obviously he's speaking, so he sometimes doesn't finish the sentence. I think that the countries in particular that today we call the New World or the Global South are not sufficiently represented in international institutions, which up to today have always been in the hands of the US and other relatively important countries. But now we have India, African countries are not represented in accordance with, according to the population, according to their weight on the international scene. So we must review how these international organizations are organized. As to the International Criminal Court, as well as the International Criminal Court, the UN has been making decisions based on false information. For example, the war in Iraq. Remember the weapons of mass destruction? That was a lie that caused the death of 1,400,000 people, with massive bombings of the civilian population then too. I think that in a balanced democratic world, a multipolar world, these legal bodies have to become representative. They have a right, these countries have a right, a real right to condemn or condone, to sanction, and well, they must play their role. Every country has a right to be heard. Interviewer, we were talking earlier about Ukraine, about this proxy war. Do you see in this Israeli-Palestine scenario precisely the same American interest issues? We know that the US is very much on the side of Israel. I didn't translate that very well. Yes, it's the same thing with the US being very openly on one side, I think she means. His answer, Israel is always being a natural ally of the United States and vice versa. You have to take into account that all these takes place in the context of an election campaign in the United States, where the position of Anglo-Saxon finance holds its place. And I think that the American role, is a disastrous one, because they are opposed to any resolution which aims to a ceasefire. And I believe this blind confidence is given in an unmeasured and systematic way. Um, this is serious. It is the Palestinian population who is paying the price, and I still like to emphasize, as I said several times, even the Israeli government themselves, as well as certain Israeli secret services, they have expressed the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, that he for a long time financed Hamas because he wanted a force which opposed the extremist Islamist groups as well as the PLO. Um, in fact, they, they, they had known that there was a large-scale operation in preparation, because the Israeli Secret Service are efficient and very attentive to what can happen, what is likely to happen, and heard of extremely important underground activity. This government, the Israeli government, after 20 years in power, is now weakened, very much weakened. You know, at worst, they ignored the danger. It must be emphasized that the vital interests of Israel have to be respected, but also the humanitarian interest of the Palestinian population must be preserved. There is still a wish on the part of the Americans to put in place a diplomatic alignment in the region. Well, in Ukraine, the peace agreements that were being put in place were torpedoed, in particular those put forward by President Bennett of Israel and President Erdogan of Turkey. They were torpedoed by Boris Johnson from the UK, who was sent there by the Americans, who hastened to cancel any peace agreement, to stop the process to peace. And now we must stop this escalation, which is both dangerous and tragic. Both dangerous and tragic, and which will bring about an increase in terrorist attacks in France and in Europe. We must be aware of the consequences. President Macron, resolutely pro-Israeli without any discernment, he has certainly increased the risk of terrorism in France. The American position, as always, is a short-term position. It is dangerous, in no way foresees that it is creating so much instability now and in the future. The interviewer says, regarding presidential elections in the US, which you touched upon at the beginning, I wanted to ask you to comment. You are the grandson of General de Gaulle, but we have in America the nephew of President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. What is your opinion as to this candidate? Well, he's interesting. He says the right things. He has the merit, at least, of having a conscience, telling the truth regarding international issues to do with the United States, the instability and crisis positions that it arouses. Perhaps Kennedy proposes a different alternative, an alternative of balance between his own country and the international scene. America must reinvent itself. It cannot continue to hope that NATO will last while destroying the competitiveness of those European countries that make up NATO. America has to reinvent its way of doing things. I think Kennedy expresses this well, and that is interesting, useful, and necessary. Question. He also took up his uncle's stand concerning the deep state, so-called, and the authors of the attack that killed his uncle and father. Do you think he wants to clean up the US? Answer. I said earlier that America in the political economic sphere is a culture about efficiency. It has done wonderful things. It has built wonderful things, to be sure. But I repeat, it must profoundly reinvent this pattern of doing things, in particular towards go back towards the meaning of traditional values. It is at the moment a culture of utmost extreme consumerism. Consumption. Systematic, continuous marketing about everything, a culture based on the individual consumer of products consumed, and it needs to come back. Excuse me. It needs to come back to fundamental values, which were also its own values. A third of Americans are extremely patriotic. The American flag is displayed in many houses. I think these are fair and just values. My grandfather had said of Americans that they are like big children. But it must reinvent itself. It is necessary for the balance and stability of the whole world. They are our natural allies. I will say again, but not in this current imperialistic, unilateralist, and hegemonic way. Then they go on to talk about more things to do with France, domestic policies, and so on. And he also refers to the fact that he has created a forum, the Pierre De Gaulle Foundation, where people can donate. I think he said that he was thinking very seriously about running for president of France, and he probably will. So this is, I just wanted to conclude it and to what do you think of this interview? Let me know. And thank you very much for listening again. Bye-bye.